Today's daf is daf ayin hey, and we'll start on the bottom of daf ayin daled amud beis with the Gemara 4 lines before the end of the Amud. And the Mishnah had said, "Kol hamenachos hanasos bekli tu'unos sholosh matonos." So we're going to put the shemen into the flour to create the mincha 3 times in 3 installments, as we called it yesterday. And the Mishnah specifies that we're only talking about menachos that are nasos bekli. Amar Rav Papa lemute mai Amar Rav Papa lemute minchas mafe. Minchas mafe is a mincha that's made in the oven, in the tanur, and the tanur does not have the status of a kli sharis. And therefore, as far as a minchas mafe is concerned, which is chalos or rakikin, according to Reb Shimon, you could have a combination of 5 chalos and 5 rakikin. Whatever the minchas mafe is, it doesn't require that threefold installment of shemen. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a brisa. The im minchas marcheshes, we're darshaning a pasuk here, which is at the beginning of Vayikra, with regard to the minchas marcheshes, and it says karbanecha. So we're going to focus on, first of all, the beginning of the pasuk, which is minchas marcheshes, and then we're going to focus on the words karbanecha. Karbanecha will be a ribui to expand beyond the confinement of the minchas marcheshes. Soles bashemen te'asa. So here we're talking about the first addition of the shemen, where you pour the shemen on the first of the 3 installments into the kli shares before you even pour in the flour. Malamed sheteuna matan shemen bekli. So matan shemen bekli, even though it's mentioned at the end of the Mishnah in the enumeration of the 3 matanos, but nevertheless, it's the first of the 3. And then the word karbanecha l'gzeres shava. So the gzeres shava here is going to expand the application of this halacha of matan shemen bekli from minchas marcheshes, which is explicit in the pasuk, to include other menachos. And now we start today's daf, which is ayin hey. What do we derive from this gzeres shava? Ma kan matan shemen bekli. Af lahalon. Lahalon is referring to the next pasuk, which introduces what's called the minchas machvas. Both menachos refer to the flour being fried in a pan. One is a deeper pan, one is a flat pan, with oil. Umalahal yitzika ubelila. Now the second installment is called yitzika, which is the pouring of the oil after already the chalos were baked. And then there's some extra shemen left in the kli. That's called belila. Afkan, here too, with regard to a minchas machvas, we're going to say yitziko belila. No, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. In minchas marcheshes, we know about matan shemen v'kli, the first installment, when the shemen is put into the kli. That's explicit in the Torah. In the case of minchas machvas, what's explicit in the Torah is yitzika ubelila. The gzeres shava now is going to teach us that whatever applies to a minchas marcheshes, namely matan shemen v'kli, applies to a minchas machvas. In minchas machvas, we have yitzika and belila, and the gzeres shava is going to teach me that just like in the case of a minchas machvas, we require yitzika ubelila, so too we require those 2 additional installments of shemen in the case of a minchas marcheshes. So both minchas marcheshes and minchas machvas will require all 3. Number 1, matan shemen bekli. Number 2, yitzika. Number 3, belila. Now the Rishonim point out that once we know that these 2 menachos will require all three installments of shemen. We're going to apply that universally to all menachos, as long as there's a kli, as opposed to the minchas mafer, which is baked in the oven, that doesn't have a kli. Now the Mishnah says that with regard to the second installment, again, because the Mishnah goes backwards in the reverse order, so we have Matan Shem B'Kli at the end of the Mishnah, then we go up to Belila, and then from Belila we go up to Yitzika. So actually the second installment is called Belila. Chalos Bololon, Divrei Rebbe, V'chacham Omrim Solis. So now the Mishnah introduces a machlokas tanoim between Rebbe and the Chachamim as to whether or not the second installment of Shemen, namely what we call Belila, is added to the mixture before it's fried or is only added after the frying. So here's the machlokas. Rebbe holds that you delay the second installment of shemen, namely blila, until after you've already fried the menachos either in a machvas or a marcheshes. Chachamim, on the other hand, hold that the second installment is added to the dough before you bake the loaves, before you actually, again, I use the word baking, but that's not really the right precise language. It should be frying. Torah Rabbanon, now the Brisa is going to present the machlokes of Rebbe and Chachamim as it appears in the parsha, meaning in the drushos and the biblical exegesis. Soles blula. How do we interpret soles blula? So we're talking about blila, right? That's the second installment, which is the subject of the controversy between Rebbe and the Chachamim. Is melamed shenivleles soles. So this is the shita of the Chachamim, that the word soles here, as an introduction to Belila, is meant to teach us that the Belila is going to take place when it's still soles. Soles means it still has the status of flour before it's fried. So that according to the Chachamim, both stage number one of Matan Shemen B'Kli and stage number two, which is called Belila, the second pouring of the Shemen, both take place before the frying, before you have loaves. Rebbe disagrees, and he holds chalos bolulon. It's only after they already reached the stage of chalos, which means they were fried, either, right, they were fried, then you pour in the second installment of Shema, which is called Belila. Shenemar chalos blulos, because even though the word blulos appears at the end of the pasuk, but the word chalos appears at the beginning of the pasuk to tell you that the blulos is only after it became chalos. Amru lo, the Chachamim responded, Valo lachmei toda never ben chalos, the efshel bolong shein chalos ela solas. In the case of lachmei toda, which means a person who brings a korban toda that has to be accompanied by 40 lechamim, then it's impossible. In the case of lachmei toda, that has to do with the very limited volume of oil that's added to lachmei toda, as we'll soon see in the Gemara. It's impossible to add the oil after the chalos. There's no oil left. And therefore, since we have the paradigmic case of lachmei toda, where presumably even Rebbe will have to agree that the second installment, which is called the Belila, could not take place after it became loaves and it was already baked because there's not enough shemen left. So therefore, we should apply the same yardstick to all the menachos. Ketzad oseh. So therefore, what would be the procedure according to the Chachamim? No sein shemen b'kli. The first thing you do is you pour the shemen into the kli. Kodem lasiyosan. It means nothing has happened yet, and stage number one is pouring the shemen into the kli. Then, after he pours the shemen in the kli, nosna. Now the brisa doesn't fill in the noun over here. The noun here is nosein es hakemach. So you add the kemach onto the oil, and then nosein shemen oleu bolula. Now we're ready for blila, the second installment of adding shemen before the baking, the frying is done. And this is the sheet of the Tanakama. And now velosha. Now he kneads together the two installments of shemen, one before he put in the flour and one after he put in the flour, and then uposisa. So the posisa, that's going to be a whole subject. We'll start it today and maybe finish it tomorrow. Anyway, now we're up to Yitzika, which is the third installment of shemen, which according to everyone applies after the psisa, meaning after you've already made the loaves, and then you do kmitza. So all this, the three installments of shemen with the flour, and the act of psisa, of breaking up the loaves into small pieces, all this takes place before the kmitza. However, that's the chachamim. Rebbe disagrees. Chalos bolol, and it's only after you made it already into chalos, then you do the second installment, which is called blila. Shenemar, because he derives from the pasuk chalos blulos b'shemen. So first it became chalos because he fried it, and that frying process to create the chalos took place with one single installment of shemen, and then blula b'shemen means he does the blila by adding the second installment of shemen. Said no say shemen b'kli kodem latziyasa. So far, so good. Even the Chacham agree that that's the first stage of matan shemen b'kli. Then vinosna, and again the Chacham would agree that after the first installment of shemen in the kli, the empty kli, now we add the flour. But whereas the Chachamim here would want to see now, after you add the flour, a second addition of oil, which is called blila. According to Rebbe, Lasha, Ofa. Again, the word Ofa is a little bit strange over here because we're talking really about frying, which is called tigun, but nevertheless. Then posisa, and now, according to Rebbe, we're ready for the second installment of shemen, which is called blila, v'nosein oleha shemen ubola. And now, at this point, you've added shemen, and you're somehow kneading or mixing together the oil of the second installment with loaves that have already been baked, but they've already been broken into pieces as well. So once you break them into pieces, then you can mix in additional shemen, and at that point he fulfills the mitzvah belila. And now, once he has this concoction over here, kind of like a dough, but it's the second round of a dough, now he has yitzika, and that's called the choser v'nosen al Hashem and v'kometz. So the Gemara raises the following objection: Efshar, what did the Rabbanan mean when they attacked Rebbe and they said, well, in the case of Toda, of Lachmei Toda, you have to admit that the shemen is added at the beginning, meaning before the actual baking, because there's no shemen left afterwards. The Kami Rabbanan Rebbe, what was their argument? What did they see in Lachmei Toda? Amar Reb Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, Revius Shemenhi. This is in the Korban Toda, the Torah says that you have to use a very limited amount of oil, of shemen, and that's called a revius lug, a revius of a log. How could it possibly be that you've already baked the challah and now you still have enough oil left to add and make a blila? It must be that the limited amount of oil is added to the flour before the baking twice. Once nosein lekli, afterwards the flour, and afterwards the rest of the revius halot. Vaita, the Mishnah says, achalos tunos blila rekika meshicha. Now, a mafet tanur, as we said over and over again, has two different possibilities. Either it's 10 chalos, which are matzah, or 10 rekikin. Now, the difference would be the following. That in the case of chalos, we actually mix in the oil to create a dough before we bake the challah. In the case of rekikin, we add the oil afterwards, and that's called meshicha, and the Gemara is going to ask what the meshicha looks like, and basically you smear the oil on the top of the rekikim. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the Brisa, chalos, blulos, velo rekikin, blulin. The whole concept of blila, of adding oil in order to mix up with the flour, and after you bake that as a dough, that only applies to chalos, but does not apply to rekikin, because the pasuk says chalos blulos. So it means blila is applicable to chalos, but not to rekikin. And the Gemara says that logically, I would have come to the opposite conclusion. Why? Sheyachal dinhu ma chalos she'enan tunis meshicha. The Torah was more machmir in requiring, in the case of rekikim, that you do the meshich on top of the rekikim to unos blila. So chalos, the Torah was mekil and said there's no need for meshicha, and yet the Torah still says that you need blila. Is rekikin shetuna meshicha eino din? How much more so shetuna and blila? Talmud Lomer. Therefore, the pasuk went out of its way to say chalos blulos v'lo rekikim blula. On the other hand, rekikim meshuchin v'lo chalos meshuchos. Now we're going to have a kavachom in the opposite direction to require meshicha in the case of chalos, because the Torah was more machmer in the case of chalos, required blila, and therefore the Torah certainly should have required meshicha. V'lo chalos meshuchos sheyochal alodinu ma rekikin she'enam tu'unim blila tu'unim meshicha. Right, the Torah in the case of rekikin was very lenient and did not require blila, and yet it requires meshicha. Then in the case of chalos shetunis blila, the Torah there was no leniency in the case of chalos, and then chalos require blila, and if they require blila, then ain't no din shetunim meshicha. How much more so you have to do the meshicha on top after it's baked? Talmud Lomer rekikim meshuchim v'lo chalos meshuchos. So the Gemara says, my Talmudah. The Brisa comes to the conclusion that although the chalos require blila, rekikim do not require blila, so we don't mix the oil in. How do we know this? Now, the answer to the Gemara's kasha is quite obvious, even before we see Rava, and that is the Torah explicitly said chalos blulos to the exclusion of rekikim. But the Gemara is still not happy with that, because as we derive from the Kal V'chomer logically, if chalos require blila, then how much more so should rekikin require blila? Meaning that if the Torah wanted all these procedures, whether it's blila or whether it's meshicha, to apply to both categories, namely to both chalos and to rekikim, then the Torah should have said chalos urekikim, blulos, bashemen, umeshuchos. But from the fact that the Torah separated it and said that only chalos require blula and only rekikim require meshicha, it means that it's bedavka. Now the Mishnah says, Keitzad moshchin. what is this Mashiach on top of the Rikikin? What does it look like? Kamin ki. Now, there are many, many different interpretations of what this. Actually, I shouldn't say ki with a chaf degusha. It's really chi. Now, what is chi? So it seems that chi is a letter in Greek. And some say it's the 20th letter in the Greek alphabet, and it looks like a U. So the Mashiach is done on the top of the wafers in a U form. However, some Rishonim say it looks like a tes, which means it goes like this and then it turns in. Others say it looks like a ches, which means it's got two legs and a crossbar. So there are many, many different interpretations of what this chi actually looks like. So ashar nechal. Okay. So it's a Greek letter called chi. Now, is there a view amongst the Tanoim that in the case of a minchas mafeh, you can bring 5 chalos and 5 rikikim? The answer is we've already encountered that sheet, and that's the sheet of Reb Shimon. So you don't have to bring 10 chalos and 10 rikikim, it could be 5 and 5. So now the Brisa wants to know, according to the sheet of Reb Shimon, what exactly is the procedure? Toner Rabbanon, mincha ba mechza chalos and mechza rikikim, 5 chalos and 5 rikikim, maybe log shemen v'chotzehu, a full log. Okay, let's keep in mind, because lachmei toda we said was a revius halog, but okay, now it's a full log. Now he splits that log into half, chetzio lechalos v'chetzio rikikim. But there's a fundamental difference. The half a log for the chalos is going to be added before the frying, for the baking. Whereas the half a log for a kikim is going to be smeared on top after it's baked. Chalos bololon. So with regard to chalos, we're going to mix in, that's called blila, the oil on the second round into this mixture of dough to create a dough. But rikikin, we're going to take that half of oil of a log shemen, because we've already used up half of the log shemen for the chalos, and now we're left with a half a log of shemen, which is going to be smeared as a chi on the top of the wafers. Now, as far as this last line is concerned, this is going to be a controversy. The first opinion mentioned in this brisa has it that if after you use up half of the log shemen and then the other half of the log shemen, there's still some shemen left over, the remnants, machziro lechal. So according to the Tanakama here, which we just learned, you go back to the chalos and you mix them in with the chalos. And that's called blila. There's another possibility, and that is any leftover shemen from the log should be given to the kohen. And that's going to be the opinion, as we see it now, the dissenting opinion often here in the Brisa of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Shimon Omer, Moshchan Kaminchi, that's fine. And Shara Shemen, any remnants of Shemen, is Nechal LeKohen. Now again, if we could learn this be'ir, and I'd love to know what lies here at the fundamental point of this machlokas. Where does it emanate from? Yeah, I'm tempted to think that the machlokas really revolves around whether or not the Torah says that the log shemen for a mafeh, for minchas mafeh, is meant to be used for the mincha itself, or is there still a shirayim? Anyway, Tanya, either we have another brayso, rikikin aboim b'fnei atzmon. What happens if a person takes upon himself a voluntary carbon, which is called rikikim, is mevi log shemen, moshchan v'chozer moshchan. He does a double mashicha. Because again, we just learned that the log shemen would be enough for 5 chalos and the other half for the 5 rikikim. So you're only left with a chatzi log. Here, he doesn't have chalos. So he only has rikikim. So he's got a log shemen. That's the absolute requirement here of a minchas mafer. But on the other hand, he doesn't need a full log shemen for Mashiach. So therefore, he does a double Mashiach. First, he does Mashiach number one, and whatever shemen he uses up, that's round one. And then he does a second Mashiach with the remnant oil. Now again, this is a reflection of the Tanakama, who doesn't have the possibility of giving any extra oil, remnant oil, to the Kohen, because that would be a simple solution to this problem. You have a full log shemen for Rikikim. You don't need that much shemen. Normally a half a log would be enough, because you have the other half for the chalos. So what do you do with the remnant shemen? But this is the Tanakama who holds that somehow that full log shemen has to be given over to the mincha. So you do another Mashiach. But Rabbi Shimon, Moshchem Kimin, Chi, Ushar Shemen Echel Kodesh. And that leads us up to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Ayin A. Okay. We mentioned before that after the baking process, there's something called psisa. So this is going to be the subject of this Mishnah and the next Mishnah. Kol Menachos hanasus bekli to unos psisa. And again, we're going to have Rav Papa in a minute as to why it's only, what is the Mishnah trying to exclude, and there's no psisa. It's something that's not nasis bekli. Lemute mayom Rav Papa lemute shtei alechem v'lechem aponim. So in these two karbanos, we don't require psisa. We don't break them into smaller little crumbs, little pieces. What's the basis for that? The shtei lechem and the lechem aponim are only baked in an oven. They don't have any klisharis, because we're holding now that the tanur, the oven in which they're baked, does not have the status of a klisharis. Tanur Rabbanu, we learned in a brayso. Pasos osam pitim mincha. Now, we have the psisa at the beginning of the pasuk, and then we have the word mincha at the end of the pasuk. What is the word mincha at the end of the pasuk adding? L'rabos, to add kol hamenachos l'psisa. Okay, if kol hamenachos l'psisa, fine. Let's apply that to shtei alechem and to lechem upon it. Yochanan Talmud Lomar osa. It says pasos osa, and that's a miyut. And the miyut is coming to exclude shtei alechem and lechem upon him. They don't require being broken into smaller pieces. Now, how do you know that this miyut of osa is coming to exclude shtei alechem and lechem upon him? What about other minchas mafer? So the answer is, and it's a very technical point, that we have basically two miutim. And the two miutim would make sense. I'm sorry. We should require two miutim. There's only one miut. Because if you're dealing with a minchas mafer, you would need two miutim to exclude psisa. You would need one for the chalos and another for the rikikim. And here we only have one miut. If we have one miut, then it's got to refer to lechem aponim and to shtei alechem, because they are called lechem. So shtei alechem and lechem aponim are called one entity in that context. The brayso now goes on to the next part of the pasuk. V'yatzakta shemen mincha. Once again, the word mincha is coming as a ribui. L'rabos kol menachos l'yitzika. Okay, so yitzika, we said, was the third stage after he did already the pelila, and that applies to all menachos, right? We had a havmin to say it only applies to minchas machvas, minchas marcheshes. Yochel shenimar b'minchas mafer. is there a requirement of Yitzika with regard to Minchas Mafe, Talmud Lomer, Oleh Shemen? And the word Oleh is a mute. And one mute is not enough. As we said, when it comes to Minchas Mafe, we have both Chalos and Rekikin. So Otzias Chalos, Otzias Rekikin, Talmud Lomer He. So we have a second mute, and that's going to exclude not only Chalos, but also Rekikim as far as Yitzika is concerned. So once again, a Minchas Mafe in general requires Psisa, but it doesn't require Yitzika. My Talmudah, the Pasuk says Oleha, that's a mute. The Pasuk says who, or I should say he, that's a mute. But how do you know it's coming to exclude a Minchas Mafe? Otzi, Ema, Hotzi, Minchas Kohanim. Maybe it should exclude a Minchas Kohanim, which is a Karban Yachid bin Dava that's brought by a Kohen, or a Karban Chova that's brought by a Kohen in the case that he was a Chote. And maybe the Torah is excluding Yitzika in the case of the Kohen, whether it's the Kohen who voluntarily brings a Karban Mincha, whether it's a Kohen who's obligated to bring a Karban Mincha.